Thank you very much, Sarah, and appreciate everybody that has found the time to join. Hopefully, you'll find this useful. But before we begin, I just want to give you a quick background on me. So, most of my career, I've been very heavily invested in DoD, working with DoD, primarily on the contracting side. And so I understand a lot of the security, the compliance, and oftentimes even just the cultural differences that exist between DoD versus, say, private sector. And I think it's important to know that stuff because a lot of times the challenges that we face are very different. And so hopefully this presentation or webinar can kind of speak to your current situation and give you some perspective on how to build an automation strategy. So for today, one of the things that I'm going to focus on heavily is thinking about automation in a way that you can strategically increase the value of what you do as a team. And so if I think back, I remember it was about 6 or 7 years ago when DoD, it might have been even further back than that. I've kind of lost track of time, but when DoD came out with that cloud mandate, and DoD was like, hey, we want everybody to go to the cloud. And during that time, I was extremely excited to go work on this project where we had some legacy systems we were working on, and we wanted to then move them or migrate them into the cloud. And luckily, we got the opportunity to refactor a lot of that and then move it up. And some of the challenges we had was we had a lot of this legacy infrastructure, and all of a sudden, things were changing. And in that change, we saw an opportunity to say, well, we get the opportunity to change things. Let's see if we can build in some automation. So a lot of what I kind of learned during that process has been very useful in coming up to this point. And additionally, I also spent quite a few years working very closely with the security teams. And this, by security team, I mean IA, or some people call them cyber now. But I've taken a couple packages through the old school DICAP, which I generally found to be a little bit easier in the past. But then when they did the migration out to RMF, I worked on a couple of those packages to get them through to ATO. And so there are a ton of challenges that we face that's very specific to the DoD. And hopefully a lot of what we do can not only increase the velocity that our teams move at, but also just make our jobs a lot more fun. And so I'm sure many of you have experienced quite a large change in your lives. Right? Some of us are working remotely, and some of us are back back in the data center, back in our classified environments. But all of us have definitely heard upper leadership talk about things like automation. And so some of those concepts could be good. Some of them may not be that great, right, in your heads. But hopefully I can kind of bring some control around how we can execute our automation strategies. And if we execute it properly, what we should see is that we should see our jobs become better. And we should be able to see our teams move faster. And so what I really want us to do is begin to focus on more of the enterprise view of what we do and how it affects out to the agency. And so all along, we've all had automation, right? Automation is not a new concept. We've always had it. I personally have written a number of Python scripts. Some of you may be Bash experts or Perl experts. Those are all automations, and they're legitimately good. We can automate most near a ton of our work that we do. The problem is that when we automate at that level, it's very difficult to maintain down the long run, because we may be experts of the automations we build. We understand which edge cases work and which don't, but the greater enterprise doesn't. And it may affect my job, meaning it makes my job easier, faster, so I don't have to do the manual day-to-day toil, but the wider team or even the adjacent teams next to me within the agency can't leverage that automation. So today, the focus in terms of creating ROI or increasing ROI is to come up with an automation strategy that allows us to scale. And in order to scale, we need to coordinate across the entire enterprise. And so one thing that is very common is that the problems that we face in the enterprise setting is often faced by several of our teams. Right? It's not the exact same problem. For example, say you take the STIG. We all know we have to STIG our servers, our desktops. But the STIG may be very slightly different, right? About 80 to 90% of it is the same, and then we have 10 to 20% that's different. But overall, that problem is very similar. And what's happening now in defense agencies is that, or not just agencies, but across the DoD, is oftentimes every team is coming up with their own way of STIGing. And so we have a lot of this duplication of effort that's happening. But what if we could focus our effort into one joint solution that is extremely robust, where it doesn't just cover the 80%, but it can be customized across. And so let's get rid of all the domain-specific tools that we have and see if we can integrate across. There is going to be overlap, right? The dev teams are often going to work with the ops team at some point, right? And the security folks will need certain things that they deliver either to the dev side or the dev side delivers out to them. And then also on the networking side. And so the challenges very much in engineering or in IT are very similar. They're just slightly different when we view them. But in order to get to that point, we do need to figure out how we can break down silos. In order to do that, Red Hat's approach has been to provide a single platform that is usable by every single line of business. So not just the dev side, but even the security side. And what that means is that the platform can't be specific to one set of skills, because the set of skills that's available, say, for a network side is very specialized. And if we provide them a platform that's too difficult to lose or to use, then it doesn't get used, correct? And so we'd like to break down these silos, provide a single platform that can then provide governance across the entire enterprise. And then the end result there is we get more collaboration. The more we can get security, dev, IT ops, networking all working together and increasing the quality of one solution rather than working on 10 different solutions, the faster we move and the more ROI we obtain. And so Red Hat's approach here is what I'd like to call the platform approach. Rather than thinking of it as single point products that are automating for this one specific solution that we need, let's think of the greater platform. And a lot of times in our lives, we've seen the benefit of a platform. Say, for example, in mobile development. Back in the early 2000s, when mobile smartphones started becoming a big thing, the platform was a big thing, right? Both Apple and Android began to provide a platform that developers could then easily onload and then build apps for, and that platform provided the consumers of those apps. And then that increased the adoption overall. And so very similarly, we want to increase adoption across the enterprise. But in order to do that, we need three primary things. One, it's got to be able to hit every endpoint device that we have. So it can't be a specific Linux-only tool. It needs to be able to hit the networking side. It needs to be able to hit our cloud infrastructure, our cloud services. It needs to be able to do all the security tasks we have. So it has to be able to hit a broad number of devices and also a broad number of use cases. Additionally, it's got to be simple, right? And in the past, when I worked with the DevOps team, I had Windows admins who did not ever want to touch a Linux system, and that's fair. But I was able to onload them to be able to write Ansible playbooks because they're very easy to not only read, but easy to adjust to define exactly what you want to see. And then lastly, if we want to hit our hybrid environments, including our networking side, those networking devices are appliances. We can't put agents on them. So it needs to be agentless. So these are the three things that's going to allow us to have the platform be able to reach out to the greater enterprise, right? So touch the entire IT footprint. And some of the things in that middle block, you see, we'd like to do things like orchestrate or manage configurations. So it could be specific configurations, for example, a web app server versus a database server. And ultimately, the goal is to deploy applications. But in order to deploy applications and ensure their stability and the security, well, we need to be able to test constantly. And we need to be able to do it, make sure our test iterations are extremely fast. That means provisioning, deprovisioning. And that way, when we see errors, we build up our infrastructure, we test our code, and then when we've successfully tested or we found an error, then we deprovision or tear it down and we start over. And the faster we can do this, the faster we can deliver out to our customers or to our consumers. And of course, let's not forget things like securing or security and compliance. Those are extremely key, especially on the defense side. And of course, those are the things we need to do, but we also need to do them on a wide variety of endpoints. Take, for example, firewalls, load balancers, and the applications that either we're building or COTS software that we're using, lightweight containers that we may be moving to, and virtualization platforms like the cloud. And not just one cloud like AWS, but it would need to be Azure and GCP. But in order to do all this and have a single platform that can automate across the entire IT footprint, what we really need is we need help. And our teams need help. And so the Red Hat's approach is that not only do we provide that platform, but the platform has to have the proper tooling that's available. And so Ansible automation platform has 90 certified platforms. What that means is we have certified content that your teams can consume to be able to work across the vast ecosystem and across other technology partners' softwares, for example, Google Cloud or Microsoft Cloud, right, Azure, or Cisco devices, F5, Palo Alto, and there's a vast number of certified content because we know that no matter how much community content is out there, enterprises need certified content that they can trust in, content that is stable, that is actually created by both Red Hat and the vendors themselves, for example, Cisco. And just a quick view, let me snap over to what we call our content collections. If you go to cloud.redhat.com and you log in, it provides you, Ansible automation platform provides you with what we call collections on the left-hand side. And in collections, currently there's about 97 of them. You'll see that these are all tagged as being certified. And so if I were to search, say, for example, for ServiceNow, which is a ITSM, or you could think of it as like a ticketing system, a very robust ticketing system, there is an Ansible collection that allows you to work with ServiceNow and automate by connecting Ansible with ServiceNow so they can work together. And that's really ultimately where we begin to scale. So jumping back here, let's begin to kind of step into the demo. So over the next two sections, we'll try to keep it simple. What I want to do is walk through our Ansible Tower, which is, you can think of as an automation hub, and show you how two concepts can be applied in terms of your automation strategy. So the first thing is we'll focus on taking an enterprise platform approach, and we'll show you what that means. So essentially what I mean by this is no silos, no stray automations. And then two, what I want to do is paint a picture of what modular design for automation looks like. And so I'll take you from where you'll start, which is a very simple crawl, walk, run approach. We'll start with the crawl, we'll go to the run, and then the modular design is ultimately where you want to get to. So for section one, an enterprise platform approach, the idea here is we want our teams, our agency to be able to accelerate automation adoption. The value of that is that the more adoption we can get, the more help I can get within I myself as one member of a team, and the more the teams help each other, the faster we can move. And there are three primary concepts that I'll hit on. And I'll go through and what I'll do is I'll go back and forth between them. But the three are centralize, connect, and control. We'll start with centralization. And what I mean by centralize is no stray automations. Because stray automations, if I write a one-off automation, it's very limited in its scope of value that it can provide, right? Like it's my automation, it's one thing, it's for one specific use case. It cannot scale. So we want to avoid that. And so in this section, I'll talk through three interfaces that are provided through Ansible Tower. That way you can ensure that all automations come through a central hub. And then we'll take a look at what an automation job looks like. Let's jump over to Ansible Tower. Make sure that I'm logged in here. Okay, so this is just a very simple Ansible Tower demo system. There's not a lot happening here, but it'll serve the purpose for illustration. So here we have a dashboard. Don't want to dive too deep into it, but the idea is that if I have all of my automations coming through one point, I can have visibility across the entire enterprise. I'm currently logged in as the admin, and so I have view over everything. Now, you can always break things down into different types of team members and permissions so that, say, for example, a security ops person can view only the automations they need. So if they need to see certain reports, or if they would like to run a STIG on a system, they can do that. But here, the idea is that I have one view of the entire landscape. Now, oftentimes people get confused and they say, well, Ansible Tower, I don't need Ansible Tower because it's just a web GUI. And that's a common misconception. But what I want us to do is think back, because ultimately the goal here is centralization. If Ansible Tower was only a web GUI, the problem would be that all jobs would have to be submitted through the web GUI. That would then hamper our teams from being able to move quickly. And so there's three interfaces that's actually available. The GUI is really just one interface. So everything that you can do through the GUI, you can do through the second interface, which is the command line interface. So if you're a sysadmin and you currently have automations that you're running, and all you would like to do is augment those automations with additional Ansible playbooks, you can absolutely do that. If you've used tools like AWS CLI or Azure CLI, it's very similar to that in the sense that via the CLI or command line, you can log in to Ansible Tower, and you can then use your user account on there and execute all the automations you have access to. And you can also access all of the credentials or the credentials to the servers that you are automating against. So the CLI is the second interface. And then we also have a third interface. And the third interface is the API. If you're a developer, then you're very familiar with how to develop APIs and how APIs act as the backend, and how the front end, say, for example, your web interface then consumes that API. And so to see the API, I can easily just type in API v2 here, and you'll see that the API here, it displays what all is available, or all the endpoints that are available. So I could click through this. This is just a visual, but the end goal of the API is to be able to integrate Ansible Tower's functionality into many other systems. And we'll talk through that in the connect portion. So jumping back out, what we see now is we've seen the three different interfaces. Now let's step in and see what a job looks like. If I click on jobs on the left-hand menu, I'm given all of the job executions that have been executed. And so if we centralize all of our automations, then we have auditability, and we have traceability, and we have control. That's ultimately what we're trying to achieve. So let's take a quick look at number 2, which is the Ansible official demo project. It's a very simple playbook that has been executed. But what we see here is under details on the left-hand side, we see things like the status. Was this run successfully or did it fail? When did it start? When did it finish? Who ran it? So I logged in as an admin, ran this yesterday at 10:51 a.m. Eastern Time. I know what project it's mapped to, and we'll dive into exactly what a project is. Essentially, users can be mapped into projects very similarly to how your Atlassian tools work or GitHub, GitLab, if you're familiar with that. It's just a construct that's available where you can map users and what they're working on to a project. And also, we have something that's very important, which is the revision of the playbook that was executed. And that's key, because what we want ultimately is to be able to trace every automation execution back to the exact code that existed. And so for Ansible official demo project, we see that the revision number is here. This project is mapped to source control. If I jump over to this tab, I have the source control or the Git repository that it's tied to. I can click on the commits, look at the hashes, and if I snap back to Ansible Tower, I see the hash or the revision hash to be 16BA185. That's the commit. If I jump back to GitHub, I see here's the commit available. And so I can tie this execution back to the exact piece of code that was being worked on. Here it just happens to be the latest because it's the demo. And so back to here, to the jobs, we also know who or what servers this was executed against. This was a very simple one. And so what we see is it was just executed against a local host. On the right-hand side, what we see here is we have the entire log output of the automation that occurred. And so it's very readable. I know it's updating some source tree. If necessary, it's updating the project using Git. It's setting the repository version value, etc. It goes down. I'd like to search through this. I can search for, say, something like version, and I'm able to filter down and see exactly what I need. It can be very useful for, say, a security engineer where they're looking for very specific things security controls being implemented. And so we can see the status of exactly what is happening across this. So essentially, the overall message here is we want everything to go through one central place. And when we get centralization, then we get to be able to connect things, and that allows us to scale outwards. And so we don't want our automations to live in a vacuum. You can think of this very similar to, say, home automation. If I have a home automation hub, all my devices can then connect to that home automation hub, and now those devices can work together. So if I detect motion outside, then I can alert myself through another speaker that's in the house and say, hey, there's been motion outside. Similarly, when we're in the enterprise automation scenario or environment, we can now have systems connect to each other. Let's jump back into Ansible Tower and we see this log here. Now, Ansible Tower provides all the logs in one central place. So if we know as an enterprise that all of our automations coming through, we have visibility over everything that has happened. It's extremely important because without visibility, we have no accountability. And so, say for instance, I'd now like to connect my Ansible Tower out to a log aggregator. That feature is available. So if you go down to settings, system, I can now offload all of my logging out to something like Splunk. So I can define the host name and the IP where my external logs are sent, and then I can have them analyzed out there. So now, when we've executed our automations, we can now have deeper insights into exactly how our automations are behaving. When we do that, we can then respond appropriately when we see something that is unexpected. And so continuing on the connect topic, We can connect to a logging aggregator here, but we can also connect Ansible Tower to other applications. And there is an application section here on the menu on the left-hand side where I can then create new applications. For instance, I could create a ServiceNow application that I'd like to hook up to. I can define the URI here and provided the authorization grant type, and then begin to create an automation flow that is more complex. So say, for example, I have tickets coming into my ServiceNow, and those tickets are for a very common problem that we know about on the networking side. Say, for instance, that problem is I can't reach this server. Maybe one of the switches or routers are down. I submit that ticket. Ansible can then be used to connect to ServiceNow, get the details of that ticket, and go triage that against, say, my Cisco devices. So jumping back to content collections, we see that there is a certified content collection that's provided by ServiceNow. And if I were to click on it, I can then load the README information, and I see I can manage ServiceNow incidents. I could update them. And so if I were to reach out to Cisco devices using, say, for example, let's go back to content collections and look through Cisco. I can take one of these, say I have an Cisco iOS devices. I could take the information, query them. I'm not manipulating these devices at all, but I am querying them, triaging the issue, and then going back to ServiceNow and updating my ServiceNow ticket with appropriate information. Then my human in the loop could come to that ServiceNow ticket and then take an appropriate action. Maybe that action is kicking off an Ansible automation to remediate that problem if it's a common problem that we know. And so the overall concept that I'm trying to drive home right now is think of how to connect your automations to the greater enterprise. The more we're able to do that, the higher our returns are on the investment of creating those automations. And then the third point that I want to drive home is control. The control is extremely important because the more control we have, the more visibility we have. And so one example that I'd like to go through is, say, for example, your credit, right? My personal credit. So I've had, if many of you are on the DoD side, I think it was, 6 or 7 years ago, I got a letter from OPM saying, well, all of your information that was in JPass now gone. So not gone, but somebody has taken it and somebody has your information. So now my credit is at risk. There was nothing I could do about it. Now, at that point, I began to realize, well, I couldn't have prevented that, even though I do everything that I can to try to prevent it. But what I can do and what I do have control over is ensuring that I have complete visibility over anything that happens. And so in Ansible, the more we centralize, the more control we get. So there are a couple concepts under control that I want to go over. So on the left-hand side, you'll see there's templates, which are our reusable automations that are developed. We have credentials, and we have projects and inventories. But there's two that I want to focus on for control. Those two are projects and credentials. And what projects and credentials are projects are how we control the automations through source control, and credentials are how we control access to the servers or the endpoints or the devices that are being automated against. Let's click on projects, and under projects, I have two projects that's available to me as an admin. One of them being the Ansible official demo project. Now, clicking on that shows me all of the information that's tied to it. I have a name, I have a description. the most important thing is that it is tied, every project in Ansible Tower is tied to some sort of SCM. It could be Git, it could be Mercurial, it could be Subversion. In this situation, it is tied to Git. And we saw that Git project earlier here. And in this Git project, we have the playbooks directory, and we have subdirectories of developer infrastructure network security. If I were to click on security, I have a hardening playbook here and an open SCAP playbook. Going back out to playbooks, on the infrastructure side, I could provision VMs. I have a MySQL Server playbook, and I have all this that's available, including patching, etc. So there's a wide variety of playbooks within each project. In this scenario, all we're doing is we're saying here's the source control we have, and we're tying it to this project that's available in Ansible. Now, if I wanted, I could tie it to a specific branch. So if you have developers who are working, you can tie it to a development branch and give developers access to that Ansible project. If you have the ops side, maybe they'll be tied to either the main or the master branch. So you have a lot of control here. If you'd like to tie it to commit, you can. And there are specific users that have permission to be able to manipulate these fields. Not everybody can. So for example, my project lead could then come in and tie it to a specific branch here. So that's how projects work. In terms of control, the way credentials work is that credentials provide a certain user the access to a server or endpoint without actually allowing them to see the private parts of that credential. So if I were to click on this workshop credential, in this scenario, we have an arbitrary name we've given it, and we've defined it to be what we call a machine credential. A machine credential defines what you need to be able to SSH into a machine. In this situation, we have the username, which is an EC2 user, which is just an AWS user here. You could define a password. If I were to define a password, once I put it in, you would not be able to see it. If I have a private key, SSH private key that the user needs to use, which is the preferred way, once I put it in, and even I as the admin can no longer view that private key. You'll see that it's encrypted, and I could replace it because I have the permissions to replace it, but I can't view it. So what this allows your users to do is to be able to execute the automations against the eventual endpoints, but without actually holding that private key. They have access to use it, but never to view it. And in further options down here, if you have a signed SSH cert, drop that here. If you have a passphrase or password that goes along to that private key to unlock it, you can define that here. If you need to escalate, say via sudo or su, you can define that here and then escalate to any user and a password. So there's a lot of flexibility here in a credential, but the idea here is you want to allow users to have access, but without actually giving them the key. All right, so now we've seen centralize, connect, and control. And we know we want everything to go through one place. We want it to be able to connect outwards, but we also want to control how our automations are used. We don't want to give a developer access to a production system if they don't need access. And so we can fine tune everything and ensure that whether the automation comes through the command line or through an API, that all automations are coming through a single place so we have visibility. And so the second part of this is defining what modular design looks like. What we ultimately want to do is design things so that they can be used and then reused and expanded on. So I myself, if I develop an automation and I use it and say it cuts my work down in half, the amount of time that I spend on it by half, that's fantastic. Now, if I have another team member who can use my automation, now all of a sudden I'm getting more back for my investment. But if that is now being used by multiple teams across the enterprise, and not only are they using it, but maybe now they're pitching in to make it more robust, then we're increasing ROI by multiplying. And that's what I mean by modular design. And we always start with a crawl, walk, and a run. The way your crawl works, my advice is write down a list of all of the things that you're currently doing manually today. And the reason why I say that is if you have an automation that's currently working well, even if it's more complex, something like a Perl script that you've worked on, don't touch those in the beginning. Focus on the things that's going to give you immediate return. The reason why is because we just want to begin to take baby steps towards increasing how we understand how to write those automations. To write a very simple automation, it can just affect one server, and that's good enough. Then from there, when you go to the walk phase, the idea will be then to make that a little bit more modular. So rather than affecting, say, one server, maybe I have a provisioning script that can provision many different types of servers, right? Not just web app servers, but maybe database servers or application servers. And it just does the initial provisioning part. And then I can create a configuration manuscript that then configures those specifically to what's needed. And so in the walk phase, that's what you'll see. And then in the run phase, the idea is to not only write things at a more robust level where multiple teams can then contribute into one, but where we can all begin to leverage the work across that's being done across the enterprise. I want us to think outside of just ourselves and our teams and then think at a broader level. And so for modular design, let's go back into Ansible Tower. And what I'll show you is a playbook execution of essentially, it's not a DoD STIG, but it's very similar. It's what's called the PCI DSS OpenSCAP profile. And so I have one under job templates. If you recall, job templates are reusable automations, and you'll see why they're reusable. Go all the way down to security hardening. This is the one we want to look into. But up here, we have several different playbooks that's available. I could deploy an application. I myself have never written this, but I could deploy one. I could gather some information, some facts about a system. I could grant sudo. I could patch. I could do security patching. There's a wide variety of things that's available to me. But on the security side, I can harden a system, and I can create an OpenSCAP report. If I click into hardening, we'll go through what comprises an actual job template. The job template has some arbitrary name here. We prefixed it with a tag by tagging it as security, and we've defined it as being a hardening script. I'm giving it a simple description here. The inventory is the list of servers that it will run against. In this scenario, we've kind of pulled that back, and you'll see that in what we call a survey. The project is that project that we dove into earlier. It's tied to a Git repository that has that playbook that could be mapped to a very specific branch if we want. So in that project, we know there are multiple playbooks that are available in this. For this template, we've defined it to point to the playbook's security hardening playbook. So if I come to that playbook in Git, I see that there's a hardening.yaml. It's a very simple playbook. It says harden Linux systems. You define what hosts it will run on. Become true means that it needs elevated privileges. And here I've defined a couple variables saying, do I harden the firewall? Do I harden time? Do I harden SSH? And do I harden PCI or apply the PCI baseline? And down here, based on these replies, I then either configure the firewall, configure the time sync, harden SSH, and or apply the PCI baseline. And if you look down here, the PCI baseline is defined by what we call a role. Don't think too deep into it, but let me jump into and show you what that role is. That role is something that was developed by Red Hat. And so you see it's a Red Hat official relay PCI DSS. If I go over to GitHub, I see that I have this role available here. So all I'm doing is using that and I'm calling it. And it's pulling it in and it will then execute that role. And this will then harden the system based on the PCI DSS profile. There are other roles available. And what I expect is that in your agency, across your teams, you could very well create your own STIG profile that can then be customized on multiple levels. And I'll show you very quickly how we can customize and eventually get to the point of being at a higher level where the work that we do doesn't just impact my own project that I'm on now, but it impacts the greater enterprise. So jumping back to Ansible Tower, let me launch this. So I'll just launch this template by clicking launch. And when I do, I'm given a survey. So it says what host I'd like to configure or apply this hardening script to. And I could type in node 1. I could then configure the firewall. I could then configure time and say harden SSH, sure, why not? And then apply the PCI baseline. Here it could be the STIG. And then what I've done is gone into the system and I've defined the impact level at which it will then go harden that system to. And this is really the customization that's provided through this survey is what allows you to create automations that are used by more than one team. Without the survey, you couldn't do that, right? And it makes it very simple so that somebody who is not familiar with Ansible could then come in and begin to use an automation that was developed by somebody else by filling out the survey. So you ask, well, how do you create this survey? So in a job template, you have an edit survey button that's up here. So by creating this survey, I could then say, for example, I have a field called HIPAA or HIPAA hardening. So if I have a system that has PHI or protected health information, I can then harden it with HIPAA, and I can tie this to what's called a variable name. That variable name is what we've defined here, where these things are checked. So it's just an if check. If the user says it's true, and I can give it an arbitrary name, HIPAA hardening, and I can define the answer type could be a multiple choice. And here I can write yes, no, and select the default answer, and then add that. For this scenario, I'm going to go ahead and remove this one because we don't need it, and I'll delete the impact level because we don't need that right now, but let's just leave it like this. So if I save that, then when I launch it, you'll see that I'm now back to the original look of the survey. So let's say, for example, I'd like to run this on node 1, click yes, yes, harden SSH, apply the PCI baseline, which in this, in your scenario would be the STIG. Doesn't matter what that looks like. It's just the only thing that matters is which controls you want. And by developing the survey in a way that you can customize those controls and have the ones that you need, allows you to all contribute to developing that automation, which is about 80% the same and maybe 10 to 20% different, right? That's up to you to decide in terms of how you want to modularly design it. So if I click next, it then gives me a preview of all my answers. I can then launch it. By clicking launch, I'm now dropped down into our jobs view that we saw earlier. And here I'm seeing the status as it's running. So it's gathering all this information and it knows based on my answers what it needs to go do. And it doesn't matter. And one advice I would give is when you develop Ansible playbooks or automations, always try to build them so that they're what we call idempotent. And what idempotency is that no matter how many times I run the automation, I always get the same result. If some of you are familiar with scripting, oftentimes we can write a script that is not idempotent, meaning if I run it once, it gives, like, say, for example, I'm adding some sort of information, to a file. Now, if I don't check for that information, then I may add that a second time if I run that script a second time. And so here in Ansible, the idea is to build using idempotent modules. And when you do that, no matter how many times I run this hardening script, it will always look at the current state and only make changes if necessary. If things are already in that state, it will not mess with it. And so all of that logic is what you get through an automation platform. And so as we see this going down, I don't know if you all can see it, but it's now applying essentially all of the OpenSCAP controls to this system. And when we see the value changed, for example, we know that it's changing it. When it's saying okay, it's seeing that the state is okay. And here, I now know I have all of this information coming through. So if I need to debug this, or if I need to look for something that I do not expect, the unexpected, then I can come to a central place and view all of this information. Not only do I have it in a central place, but I, as a security person, can then just allow my developer to also come and they have a central place where they can view the results of this. So this will run. This will run for about 15 minutes. I'm not sure if it will finish in time, but essentially it's going through and applying something similar to a STIG to this system. All right, so now with that, we have the concept of being able to share and collaborate. So if I build something, I now want others to be able to use that. And so it simply comes down to some of these basic concepts that's wrapped around RBAC. Where it gets interesting is under teams. But at the highest level, what we have is something called organizations. So let's jump out of this playbook execution or job, and let's click to organization. So if my agency is very large, we want to share, but we want to create boundaries between teams, we can do that, or between maybe the greater part of the organization. You would define that here. Of course, we have users where you can map certain accesses to users. I don't need to dive into this deep, but if we do that, then for every new user that comes in, now we're mapping access to them. It's not very efficient, but we can create the users. And in this system right now, I've created Dave, who's a developer, John, who's an ops person, Sam, who's a security. But really what the value is under teams. And so we've gone over how credentials work, how projects work, how templates work. And teams allow you to give very fine-grained permissions to things like credentials and projects and templates. So for example, I could create a team here and name it ops. And all I have to do is click save, and under the ops side, I can then begin to add users to it, very similar to how you would do in, say, an Atlassian system. So here, John is my ops engineer. Click save. It will then add him as a member. I can come to permissions and define some very, very fine-grained permissions here. Because ultimately what we want is we want to be able to control automations and what people can run. So maybe I don't want my ops team to be able to influence any of the, say, network devices. Then I can define that here. And I don't want them to have credentials to be able to mess with the network, and vice versa. The network team would then not be able to access any of the ops resources. So here, under job templates, you'll notice that every template is listed here. So on my ops side, maybe I want to allow them to have things like security, patching, and patching. And so I can add these, and when I add them, then I get, well, do you want to allow them to have admin privileges, execute, or read? So here, for my standard members, none of them are project leads. All I want to do is allow them to execute these and do nothing else. So they couldn't change how these projects are set up. Let's save that, and I've now added that to the list of permissions that's available. Diving in a little bit deeper, I can then also add things like credentials. So say, for example, my ops team can work in Azure, but they shouldn't access the workshop credential. I can then filter them to have access to that one. Admin means they could change that credential. Use means that all they do is use it to run an automation. They could have read only. So there's some fine-grained permissions here, and I can save that off. Same thing for inventories. You can define inventories that they have access to. And here with inventories, you get a set of permissions that allow you to then customize that to ensure that the automations that are executed are only executed against the servers that they should be able to manipulate. Because what we want to avoid when we're running automations is we want to avoid a scenario where people are able to do things they shouldn't be able to do. And so if we take all the concepts that we've learned today, which is how can we use credentials projects to enforce control? How can we ensure that all automations come through a central place? Right? If you remember, if you think back, it was centralize, connect, control. Then ultimately what we're doing is we're driving what I call a platform approach. And if we have a platform approach and we think broader, then at that level, we're now involving everybody else that's around me to all contribute towards making our jobs easier, making our jobs more fun, because we can, rather than having to slave over the day-to-day stuff, all of the manual processes that we dislike, why not just automate those, right? And in order to automate them into production, then we need a way to be able to repeatedly test that stuff, validate it, ensure it's stable. And as you begin to go down this journey, as I like to call it, then eventually the idea is to get to what we call modular design. So rather than me creating a single automation for a single server, ultimately where I want to get to is having a number of engineers that are not necessarily on my team, all contributing to one playbook or automation that eventually I can leverage the work of. And if we do that, then we come to, what we call transformation. And it's very similar to what Microsoft did. Microsoft used Ansible automation, but it wasn't really just the solution itself. It was kind of how they approached automation strategically. And when you approach it strategically, then you're able to manage at a greater scale. So I believe Microsoft is one of the largest Ansible customers, and they do use Ansible on the networking side to manage their networks on, I believe it's Azure. And so that's a very cool story, but it happens more from the way we view things and the way we work. And I'm, hopefully what we can do is begin to expand out our concept of how automation plays out beyond just our day-to-day jobs. So if you need more resources, we have a ton of workshops that's available. I would go just type in Red Hat workshops and you'll drop into a bunch of the events and workshops that are available. If you have additional questions or you have a team that would like to dive in deeper into Ansible, let me know. I can either locate a workshop for you or I can work closely with your teams if there's specific problems or not really problems, but questions they have in terms of getting started. There's a ton of resources as Ansible is open source, so there's a very large community that's behind it. One of the most popular, I believe, Git projects that's out there. But I would strongly encourage, rather than just using it on the command line, which I do too, right? At home, my wife runs a business. She's a photographer. I build her websites. I have a push button deployment that I've built for her. It's great. And maybe I don't need Tower for my use case, but I'm also not an enterprise working at home for my wife. But in our day-to-day jobs, we do work for the greater agency. And so in that scenario, we do need something that can scale very well. Additionally, if there's training or consulting that's needed, we have training and consulting that works very closely with your teams to ensure that they're enabled. So let me jump out. I know we only have 3 minutes left, but let's see what type of Q&A questions we have. All right, so I have a question here that says, how does Ansible scale for enterprise use? And so the 3 things that I would focus on is centralize. We centralize, it's all about visibility. And if we have visibility, then we get control. And if everything comes through a central point, then we can also ensure that that central point is connected out to all of the other enterprise systems that are involved. So that's how I believe Ansible can scale. And the more we're able to scale it, the more value we're getting back, right? The return on investment. Is there any other questions? Let me see. And is there a way to, there's another question, is there a way to estimate ROI for Ansible? So yes, I believe it is there is an ROI tool that was created. If you work closely with the sales team, they can work with you to fill out essentially all of the information in terms of how many systems you have, networks, devices, and then actually draw up an ROI so that you can better understand, if I were to really begin to expand automation across my enterprise, what would be the return, right? Because we have enough we need to do on a day-to-day basis that if what we invest in to be able to innovate doesn't pay off, then it just makes my life harder. So we do want to be sure that every investment that's put in has a payoff at the end. Any other questions? I hope you all have found this useful. I do want you to begin to think about how we can be more strategic and we go about it, and how we can, create a path. So don't try to jump completely to modular design, but do think of, if I can take the lowest hanging fruit and immediately begin to get value and begin to automate manual processes that I have right now, and then I can take the next step and begin to take what I've learned and make my automations more robust. And the more robust I am, hopefully I can then add in additional teams to then begin to contribute. Think of it as an open source way. That is why Red Hat is very, very pro open source, in the sense that, as a community, we do try to contribute back, try to ensure that the things that we do impact not only our own specific domains, but outside to the greater community. All right, if there's no other questions, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's time here. And if you would like, please reach out to me. My email is DALEE or DALEE at redhat.com, or you can just, I don't know if my information is available or you can email Sarah Boltz too, whose email is on the event that was listed, and she'll make sure she directs you to either me or John Williams, who's the account executive on these accounts. Appreciate your time, and hopefully you have a good and great rest of the week. Thank you.